Welcome back to the British Chronicle, your window into Britain's stories, memories, and timeless moments. If you enjoy this journey, hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you'll never miss a new story.
What did it truly feel like to live in Britain during the 1960s? Not just the headlines or the photographs, but the quiet pulse of daily life. The click of a gas fire on a frosty morning, the smell of toast browning under a grill, dripping melting into its surface. A black and white television hummed in the corner as the family gathered, its warm light softening the edges of small living rooms. It was a decade of change, yes, but also of a surprising steadiness. Neighbors knew your name, streets felt safer, and the milkman still left bottles on the doorstep at dawn. Children played until dark, chalking hopscotch grids on pavements or racing tin cars along curbs. Radios crackled with the Beatles and the Kinks, voices that promised not only songs, but possibility. For the first time in years, after ration books and post-war austerity, there was room to believe that life could get better. Between 1950 and the mid-1960s, real wages had risen by nearly 40%, and an optimism, modest but unmistakable, seeped into kitchens and pubs alike. In small brick semis, families began to weigh the dream of a washing machine, a television, perhaps even a little car. They couldn't buy everything at once, but the idea no longer felt impossible. Supermarkets, with their tidy aisles and fluorescent glow, started to replace the old corner shop. Carpets crept across once bare floors. It was still a frugal world compared with today, but there was pride in progress, in being able to say, "We've come a long way." Britain's soundtrack shifted with his fortunes. From Liverpool pubs to Soho clubs, a wave of electric sound was taking hold. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Who, they weren't only topping charts, they were reshaping culture. London became the pulse of the British invasion, exporting youth, swagger, and a fresh defiance to the world. Teenagers found themselves with heroes of their own, voices of their own, even a style that belonged to nobody else. Music ceased to be wallpaper. It became identity. And with music came a rebellion stitched into cloth. Carnaby Street and the King's Road blossomed into living catwalks, where every hemline argued with the past. Designers such as Mary Quant offered miniskirts that startled one generation and liberated another. Twiggy's wide eyes, sharp hair, and airy charm became the emblem of a new beauty. Playful, androgynous, unpinned. Color spilled everywhere. Tights in daring neons, bold geometric prints, fabrics that seemed to hum with the same electricity that ran through guitars. Shops played rock and roll, and buying a coat felt as much part of the cultural surge as hearing a new record. Swinging London, they called it, a city shrugging off gray conformity and stepping forward in bright defiance. Clothes no longer whispered social standing. They shouted attitude. For millions of young Britons, what they wore finally matched how they felt. Loud, free, ready for a future they intended to invent. Looking back, it is tempting to see only glamour, but beneath it was something subtler. The sense of a society daring, after long restraint, to breathe deeply again. By the early 1960s, a television set was no longer a rare curiosity, but part of the furniture. Nearly 4 in 5 homes owned one, often a small box in polished wood, glowing softly in the corner of the lounge. It offered more than programs. It offered belonging. Families gathered for the Queen's Christmas speech, for the evening news, for the steady comfort of Coronation Street, or the sparkle of Blue Peter. Children rushed home from school to catch Watch with Mother, while parents chuckled at Steptoe and Son. Television stitched people together, creating a shared rhythm of jokes, cliffhangers, and headlines. The country could watch itself almost in real time, adjusting to a world that felt wider every year. Domestic life was simpler, and meals reflected that modesty. Few households had heard of couscous or curry beyond the odd mention in a travel book. Garlic was suspiciously foreign. Rice was exotic, and pasta meant tinned spaghetti hoops. Most nights, kitchens turned out meat and 2 veg, fish fingers, beans on toast, or a Sunday roast if wages allowed. Lunch boxes held cheese or corned beef sandwiches, a packet of crisps tucked at the side. Tea was a constant, strong, milky, steaming in mugs chipped from daily use. There was comfort in the sameness, in food that filled rather than impressed. Recipes were passed down like heirlooms, and a full kettle meant warmth as much as thirst. Yet beyond the quiet clatter of cutlery, a more serious revolution was underway in classrooms. Britain's old education system, a tangle of grammar schools and narrow gateways, began to open. Comprehensive schools promised broader access, and more children stayed past the age of 15. Chalk squeaked on blackboards, BBC schools broadcasts fizzed from battered radios, and new expectations gathered in the air. For working-class families, these shifts were a doorway, a chance for their sons and daughters to step into jobs their parents could scarcely imagine. By the end of the decade, the idea of higher education was no longer confined to a privileged few. It was a ladder that, at least in theory, anyone might climb. Work itself was changing shape. The heavy rhythms of mines and foundries still set the pace in some regions, but in others a quieter revolution hummed. Offices, shops, and public administration beckoned, their desks promising cleaner collars and, for some, a different kind of pride. More women joined the workforce, balancing ambition with expectations that they would keep homes immaculate and meals on the table. The service sector bloomed, hinting at a Britain turning its face from coal smoke toward paperwork, commerce, and the promise of modern efficiency. But this progress was not evenly spread. Strikes flared, and the old trades clung stubbornly in cities built on iron and shipbuilding. The nation was learning how to balance tradition with innovation, and how to imagine a career rather than merely a job for life. Young people, sharper in dress and quicker to question, wanted work that reflected their growing confidence. Advertising, journalism, even civil service posts. These no longer sounded fanciful, but part of an attainable, if still narrow, horizon. Through it all, there was a fragile sense that the country stood on the edge of something new. The steady certainties of coal scuttles and corner shops were giving way to a Britain of televisions, supermarkets, and exam results posted on school notice boards. It wasn't just a change in what people did. It was a change in how they pictured their own lives and in the space they were willing to claim inside them. Alongside new jobs and changing schools, another quiet battle was being fought, this time over equality. The 1960s gave shape and volume to a question that had simmered in whispered complaints and weary jokes. Why should gender decide your worth? From sewing factories in the Midlands to staff rooms in provincial schools, women began pressing for recognition. They sought equal pay for equal work, a simple principle that had been dismissed as fanciful only a decade before. The Equal Pay Act was still years away, but its seeds were sown in this period, in union halls and kitchen table meetings where women compared pay slips and resolved to challenge a system designed to keep them silent. Change was uneven, often resisted, but it had gained a foothold, a voice that would not be quieted again. Yet for all this talk of progress, many homes in early 1960s Britain still bore the marks of a tougher past. Indoor bathrooms were a luxury in countless terraces and cottages. Families queued for a turn at the tin bath, water heated in kettles and poured carefully before the fire. Siblings shared the same bathwater, privacy sacrificed to necessity. Outdoor toilets, prone to freezing in winter, stood in backyards. Running hot water was a prize few could boast of. To children, the sight of steam rising as their mother tipped another kettle into the tub left a permanent warmth in memory, even if at the time they shivered in the kitchen. Improvement came slowly, one plumbing job at a time, each small victory a quiet announcement that life could become more comfortable. Beyond front doors, the country's moral map was being redrawn. Laws that had long punished private identity or desire began to loosen their grip. Divorce became easier to obtain, chipping away at the shame that once bound unhappy marriages. In 1967, homosexuality was decriminalized in England and Wales, a cautious step that still carried risk, but signaled a new willingness to listen rather than condemn. The same year, abortion was legalized under specific conditions, giving women a measure of control over their bodies that previous generations had been denied. Even literature felt the wind of change. When the courts allowed Lady Chatterley's Lover to be published uncensored, it was more than a verdict on a book. It was an announcement that Britain was learning to breathe beyond the limits of old propriety. Domestic life, meanwhile, benefited from a host of small but transformative machines. By 1960s, more than half of British households owned a washing machine, freeing hours once spent scrubbing clothes by hand. Vacuum cleaners and refrigerators followed, reshaping the tempo of household work, particularly for women who still carried most of its weight. The living room, too, became a sanctuary, the television's glow now joined by the hum of new appliances, a sense that modernity had entered even the most modest of parlors. It was not glamour, but it was convenience. And with convenience came time, perhaps even a little space to rest. Still, these comforts did not erase the question at the heart of the decade. How far could progress go without losing the grounding of older ways? The warmth of collective struggle, of neighbors lending a hand to fill a bath or carry coal, was hard to measure against the lure of polished chrome and easier chores. The 1960s offered both, a loosening of restrictions and a slow unburdening of daily labor, but also a challenge to carry forward the spirit of solidarity as Britain learned to stand straighter in a freer, cleaner world. By the middle of the decade, the National Health Service had become more than a social experiment. It was a quiet cornerstone of British life. Free at the point of use, it promised that an accident, an illness, or the birth of a child would not tip a family into ruin. Babies arrived safely in maternity wards. Children's teeth were mended without parents fearing a bill. District nurses moved from house to house with a calm, competent grace. For a country still nursing the wounds of war and rationing, the NHS was a reminder that solidarity could be written into law, that care could belong to everyone. Its surgeries and waiting rooms might have been drab, but behind their beige walls was something radical, an insistence on equal worth. Meanwhile, the country's youth was no longer content to fit itself into old molds. They divided into tribes, staking their identity with music and machines. Mods, sharp in tailored suits, zipped through cities on Vespa scooters, their polished chrome flashing under streetlights. Rockers answered in leather jackets, astride thundering motorbikes, their soundtrack a raw homage to Elvis and Little Richard. On Brighton's pebbled seafront and Margate's promenades, their clashes made headlines, scuffles that alarmed the press and unsettled parents. Yet beneath the moral panic, something deeper stirred. Young Britons were inventing themselves, refusing to inherit a single uniform idea of respectability. These tribes, for all their differences, shared a generational impatience. They wanted more than security. They wanted voice, spectacle, a life that felt alive. A mod spinning beneath club lights to The Who's latest single, a rocker roaring down the A23. Both were declarations that youth was no longer an apprenticeship to adulthood, but a stage in its own right. The labels might fade, but the audacity remained. A belief that how you dressed, moved, or sang could shift the texture of the world around you. While teenagers shook the cobwebs from tradition, Britain itself was shedding an older skin. Across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, flags of new nations rose where once the Union Jack had flown. Ghana, Nigeria, Jamaica, Kenya. Names read aloud on the evening news as if reciting the map of a receding tide. At home, the meaning of empire gave way to the vocabulary of the Commonwealth. Cooperation instead of command, dialogue instead of decree. For most households, these transformations arrived as faint signals through radio static or grainy footage on the BBC, but they carried a subtler weight. Britain was learning how to be smaller and perhaps more honest about its place in the world. This post-imperial reckoning was not always smooth. Some clung to the certainties of power, uneasy at a landscape they could no longer order. Others, especially the young, saw opportunity, a chance to belong to a community of nations rather than preside over them. The shift did not erase pride, but it reframed it. Not the pride of dominion, but of resilient adaptability in the hope that a humbler Britain could still hold meaning. They called it the 60s, but to those who lived them, it was more than a decade on the calendar. It was a sensation, a widening of the horizon. Britain felt at once smaller and closer, its villages still stitched together by gossip and neighborly gestures, yet its cities alive with daring. In back streets, coal fires smoked and children chalked the pavements. In cafes and dance halls, a different energy gathered, impatient with anything stale. That mingling of the homely and the bold gave the era its peculiar warmth, a sense that the country was stepping forward without quite letting go of the handrail. The physical landscape mirrored that mixture of continuity and change. Terraced houses and prefab estates bore the traces of war, patched brickwork, gardens edged with Anderson shelters now repurposed as sheds. Yet color seeped in, peacock blue doors, patterned wallpaper, bright enamel kettles perched above new gas rings. Even municipal buildings hinted at optimism. Post offices and libraries adopted clean lines, while concrete flyovers promised speed and connection, if at the cost of old cobbled lanes. Some mourned the vanishing streets, but many more sensed a promise. That convenience, efficiency, perhaps even leisure, could be woven into everyday life. Public transport, too, was a theater of transformation. Red double-deckers rumbled through London fog. New motorways cut across farmland, symbols of a Britain keen to outpace its own past. For the first time, families could contemplate a week by the sea reached not by a weary train but by a second-hand car, its boot crammed with blankets and buckets. Holiday camps thrived, places like Butlins where formality fell away and evenings were spent under striped canopies, listening to crooners or laughing at end-of-pier comedians. A trip to Blackpool or Brighton was no longer the preserve of the well-to-do, but part of the rhythm of working life, a reward that said the grind of the week could end in sand and salt air. In homes, leisure itself was learning new shapes. Card tables folded out in parlors for games of whist or Monopoly. The wireless still held its place, but the television was increasingly the hearth, a focus not just for stories, but for shared silence, for the simple act of being together. Even chores were changing character, a washing machine's slow churn, the steady pull of a Hoover, or the icy satisfaction of milk kept cool in a new fridge. These were small revolutions, easing burdens that had pressed on generations of women. Time, once measured in scrubbing boards and coal buckets, now had pockets where laughter or idleness could live. Yet beneath the bright paint and humming gadgets, something deeper endured, a respect for effort, for keeping things going. Many families still patched clothes, mended radios, or stretched Sunday's roast into Monday's stew. They kept one foot in thrift even as the other tested the smooth floors of department stores. That duality, caution hand in hand with optimism, defined the mood of the decade. Britain was finding a new balance between what it had been asked to endure and what it dared to hope for. A negotiation played out quietly in kitchens, buses, and holiday boarding houses. Looking back now, the 1960s appear gilded by memory, but their strength lay not only in glamour or novelty, it was in the quiet resilience of ordinary lives. Cold bedrooms, coal fires that needed tending, scooters echoing down damp city streets, the rise of music that crossed oceans, and laws daring to bend toward fairness. Together they formed a mosaic of hope layered over hardship. Even as Britain's global stature receded, something within its people expanded. A conviction that life, though modest, could be better than yesterday. For millions, the decade's pulse was felt in the ordinary moments, hanging laundry in gardens newly bright with tulips, queuing at the butcher while a transistor radio murmured, "She loves you," sipping tea in front of a flickering screen as the evening news unfurled stories of strikes, moonshots, and nations shaking off colonial rule. There was an intimacy to those routines, a closeness born of shared limits and common aspirations. Communities were still stitched tight, children roamed safely between doorsteps. Neighbors borrowed sugar without ceremony. Even new tensions between tradition and innovation, security and freedom, felt somehow manageable, held within the warmth of a society that had not yet splintered into private worlds. Perhaps that is why so many recall the era as warmer, not in temperature, but in spirit. Britain was no paradise. Inequalities endured, housing shortages bit, and not every voice was heard with equal weight. Yet there was a sense, fragile but real, that progress could belong to everyone, that the future was a place to walk toward together. Streets hummed with change but also with recognition. People knew where they stood and with whom. Today, as we weigh what was gained against what may have slipped away, the 60s stand as a reminder. History is not only written in great events, but in the textures of daily life, in kettles whistling, guitars ringing, and quiet acts of faith that tomorrow might be kinder. To remember them is not merely to gaze backward, but to ask what kind of solidarity, what kind of hope we wish to carry forward. So, was Britain happier then, more united, or simply young with possibility? The answer lies as much in our present reflections as in faded photographs. Tell us how you see it in the comments below, because recalling the past is not just an act of nostalgia. It is a way of shaping how we understand ourselves now and how we imagine the country we might yet become.